I'm Jonah Willengans, and director of the Stanford Storytelling Project, and this is Module 2 in our series that will help you turn your research into a great story. Today we're going to do the 3 principles of storytelling. So last time we talked a little bit about how to move from a research paper into a story, and we talked a little bit about the main elements of storytelling: character, plot, setting. And I wound up telling you why story is such a powerful vehicle. Today we're going to just actually go to the 3 core things that storytellers in film, fiction writing, graphic novel, every medium sort of think about in one way or another in order to produce a great story. The reason that we're going to focus on this now, before you get going into your research, is that when you're doing your research, you want to be aware of some things to look for, to gather, and some decisions that you're going to be making as you prepare to create a story rather than a research paper. So you don't want to go out and do all of your research and then think about this, because you're going to find that you're going to have to go back and do more work. So we're trying to make this more efficient for you. First time out, you'll know what to look for. So the 3 main principles of storytelling, no matter what media that you're working in, are that you describe a journey in some way, that you dramatize the story concretely with vivid details, and that you build the story in scenes. And so what I'm going to do now is just do a little bit of a detailed description of these 3 with some examples for you. So we're going to start with describing a journey. So over here, and a little bit of this you'll remember from last time, what we want to do generally is to describe to our listener or our reader or our viewer a change through time. And the change is usually of a person, someone who changes, and this is the key part, significantly, and often surprisingly. If you think back to the example we had last time, where we have someone who is doing research to try to solve the problem of how to keep the muscles and bones of astronauts in their normal physical condition in a weightless environment. The changes, they actually solve that problem. So that solution is significant, and depending on how the story is told, it can be seen as being surprising. So in that example, there's a lot of failure. They tried this thing, they tried that thing. Then one day, he's playing around with something and it occurs to him, a light goes on, so he starts trying something. This works, doesn't work, and then he finds that there's an arc. Things happen through time that lead to the discovery. Some of the patterns, the most typical patterns, I'm just going to give you 3 that you could use in your own pieces and that we often see in science storytelling. So a problem to a solution, and that's the one that I've been describing with the example we've been talking about. The second one is mystery solving. So although the NASA example, there's a kind of mystery, it's more of a discrete problem that a group, NASA, is trying to figure out. With mystery solving, you have an actual condition or something occurring that nobody understands, and the journey is actually trying to figure out what is happening. So an example would be, several years ago, people discovered that some people, particularly from indigenous cultures, seem to have a sense of direction. Even if you put them in a basement of a building and spun them around and moved them around, they would know exactly, almost to the degree, which way they were facing. And doctors didn't know how this would be possible, that you would have an innate sense of direction. So they did a bunch of investigation, and it turns out that mammals, all mammals really, have the ability to have some awareness of their magnetic field. And through a series of experiments, they were able to show that some people had cultivated this. This could be trained at least at a certain age. So this is an example of a mystery being solved. A third typical arc, a journey that you could take us on, would be a conversion. And this is where the author actually takes a position, sometimes a little artificially, of disagreement or not giving legitimacy to a particular position, and then through an engagement with people or events, changes their mind. So for example, there's a claim that ambient sound, the birds outside, the hum of the radiator, the hum of the refrigerator, the hum of the lights, that we are not consciously usually paying attention to, can affect our mood. So the author of this piece, it's called Mapping the Ambient World, decides that he feels this could be true, and he's going to interview somebody who's spent a lot of time thinking about this. But to create a good story, what he decides to do is begin in disbelief. Like, this is a crazy notion that the hum of your refrigerator is making you depressed, or the drone of the lights are making you giddy. So he's going to start off here, and through his engagement, through his interviews and through his reading, he's going to slowly give more and more credence to the position until he gets to the end and accepts it and says, you know, actually, there's a good reason to believe that this may be true. So this is known as a conversion narrative. So these are 3 examples of story as a journey. And these are the kinds of things that when we get to scripting in a few modules, we'll spend more time giving you patterns. The main thing, the takeaway for the moment, is that every story has to have some kind of arc where someone changes in a significant or surprising way. Okay. So our second principle of storytelling is to dramatize concretely. And this is something particularly fiction writers pay a lot of attention to, where you want to make everything as vivid as possible. Again, we talked a little bit about this last time. You want to give your reader, your viewer, your listener traction through vivid details to help them inhabit the scene. Because the reason that storytelling is so powerful a vehicle for giving us information is because it's engaging our senses, it's engaging our emotions, it's engaging our whole brain rather than just the abstract cognition. So this is, as you will remember, the 3 elements of storytelling, the 3 main things that come in when we create a story: setting, character, and plot. As you remember, setting is typically the where and the what. Character is the who, plot is the when and the how. So in our example with the NASA research, we could say, for example, at NASA, there was this problem and they were trying to figure out how to counteract these effects on the muscles and the bones in space. And there was a scientist who figured this out and came up with a solution a couple of years ago. So I've just given you setting, character, and plot, but there's very little we're going to actually remember from that because they're all abstract and vague. So we now want to move from abstract and vague into concrete and vivid. So I'm going to do it again, but I'm going to put in the details that are going to help us actually inhabit, to actually live the story. So the setting, in a little office at NASA Ames Research in Mountain View, California, filled with scales and tubes and giant bands of rubber and all kinds of weird instruments that we had no idea what they were. There's a man named Robert Whalen. He's a small man with big hair, with a fondness for giant watches that seem to have all kinds of complex things going on that you can't, we're not even sure what they're measuring. In late 1996, he was working on this problem, and on a sunny afternoon, he was blowing up balloons for a different project or for an office party, and as he blew up the balloon, he started to realize that air pressure was creating something that increased gravity. The balloon, when filled and under higher pressure, rose in the air. And this was the seed for his discovery. Now, I'm making all of this up, but the office filled with stuff, the big hair and the watches, and the balloon, those vivid details are going to help us remember what's happening and make it real to us. So this is the second thing that you need to do when you're telling a story, and you want to keep an eye out for these kinds of details. Typically when we do research, we're focused on the information, and we typically will kind of ignore all of the other things as superfluous, and that's natural. But in your own research, what you want to do now is actually keep an eye out. What is the setting of the struggle and the discovery? Who are the people? What are they like? And when do things happen, and how do they unfold? What is the actual unfolding process? And this how is going to lead us now to the third element, which is to build story in scenes. So if any of you have listened to any Radiolab or This American Life, or if you just think about a great film that you love, they progress in scenes. They occur, the story occurs in time and space, and generally they just move from one to the other. And they're usually very large set piece scenes and then little scenes that connect them. This is a typical map of what it looks like to plot, or in some ways kind of storyboard, an oral rendition of a story, something for a podcast or audio or for even a live performance. So you can see that Freytag triangle we've had before, where you have somewhere where you're beginning, and if you remember, you're going to have somebody participate or be changed by something significant or surprising and wind up here. Now right now I just have 4 boxes. It could be less, it could be more, but for a class like a science class where you're producing a podcast that might be something like 8 minutes or 12 minutes, typically you're not going to have more than maybe 3 to 6 scenes. Generally, you want to pick on the lower side, like 3 or 4, and you may have small intervening scenes. So the structure that you're going to want to begin to imagine is not only that you have the scenes, but how you're going to move between scenes. And for this, there's a very typical structure in oral storytelling and in podcast or radio storytelling that you'll hear in things like Radiolab, where you have each scene have a progression from showing and then telling. The initial part of the scene is actually action happening. So you describe the setting, the characters involved, and what occurs. Then you explain the meaning of it or the outcome of it. So for example, we might say, NASA has this problem. That's your beginning and your inciting incident. You're triggered into the first scene, which is maybe the first attempt to solve the problem. So you show a couple of scientists working on, for example, having them work in like a big pool of water, or ways to try to recreate the physical conditioning in space that don't work. So the first thing is you're going to show this happening, and you're not going to explain anything about it. Then at the end of it, and it can be anywhere from just a few sentences to even just a sentence, you would say the outcome of this was failure. So it was a good idea, but the things that they attempted led to too much friction. It didn't realistically approximate the kind of motion that we would typically experience. And so, and this is the important part, they tried something else. So what happens in this telling is it actually leads to the next scene. So what we're seeing is you get first the actual who, what, where, and then you get the explanation, which takes you to the next scene. So after you get to this scene, and again it could just be another attempt, and then you explain the outcome of that attempt, how it leads to the next scene. So the important thing to remember here is that showing and the plot come first. And then there's just a little bit of the explaining. Then the explaining triggers the next scene. So typically what happens when we first begin to tell stories is we will mix these two things a lot. Sometimes in courses I call this the muddy middle. You're explaining, you're dramatizing, you're going back and forth, and we don't get either a concise through line for the story, an explanation of where we're going, and we don't get a lot of good, concrete, vivid detail. For most listeners, you want to divide it up. You want to get the show and then a little bit of the tell. The show, then a little bit of the tell. And this format, although you don't have to stick to it absolutely, is a really, really great way to begin. Okay, so to conclude, we've seen 3 principles of storytelling: describe a journey, dramatize concretely, and build a story in scenes. When we use these three principles, we get three kind of results. Each one leads to something really, really lovely. First is, when we describe a journey, we get what we call identification, which means that we get drawn into the information by identifying with the people in the scene, the action. We begin to feel that we are part of it. When we dramatize concretely, we get the feeling that we are inhabiting the scene. We are there. We are part of the action. It isn't simply abstract and cognitive. We're actually sensorially engaged. And when we build a story in scenes, we get grounded insight. What this means is the insight or the reflection, the learning is actually grounded in sensory experience. So these are the three things that we get when we follow these principles. So you now have a couple of things to listen to. You have a piece from Radiolab called Bird's Eye View, which is about that story about the magnetic field and orienting ourselves in space. You have a piece called Mapping the Ambient World, which is the piece about ambient sound influencing our moods. And the third one, which I didn't use as an example for describing a journey, is a piece by Malcolm Gladwell called Tough Newsroom. And I want you to listen to this one really carefully, because what it does is it actually lays out exactly this model. You're going to be able to identify very easily an inciting incident that leads to a first scene, then a very quick one-sentence explanation transition to the next scene, then again like maybe two sentences that lead to the next scene. It's very, very clear. So it's a great model for you to begin thinking about how to build your story in scenes.